depleted at an alarming rate, and there is only one Earth. Can we continue to waste the way we do? We are at a crossroads. We need to change radically our behaviors. To answer these crucial questions, we are very lucky tonight to have two speakers with extensive knowledge and expertise in these areas. I have no doubt their presentation will leave you with plenty of food for thought. Our first speaker is Nicolas Georges. Nicolas has a long successful track record on food industry innovation. He has led several organizations, small and large, through major transformational change. Until recently, he was Director of Food and Agriculture Innovation at Monash Uni. And prior to working at Monash, Nicolas has led many breakthrough innovations, launching more than 500 new products in 4 countries, whilst working for companies such as Nestlé, Mondelez, Godfrey's and Vitasoy. Nicolas is one of the 2 founders of the Mondelez Food Innovation Center at Monash. Nicolas is first and foremost an innovator and a system thinker, connecting dots, people, and capabilities for unexpected results and possibilities. Nicolas is going to shed some light on what might be the food in 2050 and the need we have to act now. So please welcome Nicolas Georges.
Thank you very much. Good night. I'll see if I need this. That's probably not the right presentation, but so whilst we load the presentation, I might just give you a couple of points about myself, just to put things in background. So as you've heard, yes, I'm going to talk about food in 2050, although I'm not going to show you too many futuristic things. But the reason I look at 2050 is because there's a lot of documented forecasting and views of what the world might be in 2050 that allows us to look at food in the context of the world by then. And I've been fortunate enough to work around the world in many food organizations over the last 25 years. And I just had the opportunity a couple of years ago to join Monash Uni to create the Food Innovation Center at Monash. What that's given me is actually the opportunity to look at food and agriculture as a sector, but look at it as well with an eye to developing its future, because obviously that's the role of universities in our country, is to develop the research that will obviously drive the breakthroughs in the future. And I have to say, I've been working for 25 years in the sector. I thought I knew pretty much what was going on, and I thought I probably had a lot of great ideas of what we could be doing in the future. But what I'm going to share with you tonight is what I've been discovering in the past 2 years, and probably a situation I didn't really understand or expect. But I also understand this is the purpose of this group, and so it's probably a good forum to share with you what I've been looking at. So really the key here is there is obviously no certainty in terms of where we're going to be in 2050. So a lot of the presentation I'm going to show to you is potential future, possible futures. There's a lot that can be done and can influx what currently the trajectory we have as a world might be. So when you start talking about food futures, a lot of people are very focused more about how we might be consuming food, whether it's things around automation and bringing robots in the kitchen, whether it's about smart foods that basically are adapted to health condition and using nanotechnology to respond to your body situations, or even food that will create cures to several diseases. And I actually believe that one, but I'll show you a bit more about this. That's not what I'm going to talk to you about today. So if that's what you were hoping to hear, I'm sorry, that's not exactly what I'm going to talk about, because along the way, whilst I was actually seeking this kind of potential breakthrough innovation, I've discovered that actually there's far more pressing things to understand about the food sector in 2050. I think the first thing is to establish, a lot of this comes from CSIRO research. If you're interested, it's called the Australian National Outlook. It's available online. There's a lot. Matter of fact, CSIRO does a lot of that modeling for many countries now after having done this work. So they have basically done foresights and reviewed a lot of source of data to try and predict what might be a possible future for the country. There's about 32 scenarios, I think, from memory. I'm just going to take the highlights and try to link them together to chat a little bit about what does that mean at the end of the day, when from where we sit today at 2018 and looking out and say, well, there are a number of transformational shifts. The first thing I would say is if you have a look at the trajectory of the world between now and 2050, transformation is probably the right word. It's not trends, it's not directional. There's some enormous changes when you look at every figures you might think of. I mean, I put a few of those on the slides, but it's essentially driven from two major factors. The first one is obviously population growth. We're predicting to be anywhere between 9.5 billion and 10 billion people by 2050. Even with the wars, even with disease, everything, we're still going to be 9.5 to 10 billion. That's a massive increase in population. Combined with that is the increase in wealth across the world, and obviously the spread of the consumption mechanisms that we've been developing over time. And so that's what's driving a lot of what you see on this slide. So I'm going to talk about this, but the consequence of all this is, one way or another, we need 70% more food to feed the world as it's trending now. So within 30 years, we almost need to double that supply. You can see if we don't change anything, some of the possible additional resources we need to create, even 60%, that's another source, but we need an extra 55% of water and 80% of energy to actually just produce the food unless something changes. So the reality, if we want to do this, the real challenge we have is we have to do this with about half the amount of resources that we use today to produce the food. And we have 30 years to find how we're going to do this. So that is a very significant, obviously, challenge, and it puts the perspective of what we have to achieve into a very large problem, really. I think there's, though, a couple of other factors that go for us, and this is why I was talking about the fact that it can be adapted, or it can be changed. The trajectory we have can be modified if we take this opportunity now to realize how the food system is critical to our future, and how we actually have to start changing some of our habits and practices right now, which I'll show you in a second. Things that are going for us is the world has never been wealthier. The GDP of the world globally has doubled over the last 10 years, and it's predicted over the next 30 that will be multiplied by 4. Now, the optimist in me looks at this and says, well, there'll be plenty of money to solve all the problems we're talking about right here. So it's certainly potentially going in the right way. Obviously, it brings with it other issues, which is the fact that this food problem is going to increase because people who access wealth are going to adapt their practices from a nutritional perspective, and generally, as you will see in a second, it's actually driving the problem even further. But the silver lining is there will be money to solve problems. The other real thing that is going for us in this is, I actually am a believer in technology, and I think that if it's targeted to the right problems, it can solve most of this. And one of the massive change we're going to see even further in the next 30 years is the exponential shift of technology. And I can't even tell you what might be possible, because we can't even think about what might be possible in 5 years. So whilst these problems are enormous, I believe we have the wealth and probably the technology to solve most of those, as long as we put them at the top of the value chain in terms of what we need to solve. And that's really what I'm trying to talk about today. The last thing, probably on a more positive note, is a lot of our food system's been driven to eliminate hunger, so it's been about improving manufacturing, it's been about reducing costs, it's been about trying to bring food everywhere. But in the past few years, the system is now taken, the power from the system of the food production has actually been taken back by consumers. And that's one thing that does give me a lot of heart in terms of how we might actually trigger some of these changes. So if I give you a minor example, but just to illustrate the point, about 5-6 years ago in the food industry where I was a happy participant, there would be a lot of argument that there would never be at significant scale gluten-free products, because it was by all means way too expensive to actually start to produce gluten-free products for just a very few minority of people who had the celiac condition. Fast forward 5 years, and I'm pretty sure you can walk across the supermarket aisle, look at every single type of product. There is a gluten-free version for every single thing that is on the shelf. That is because consumers now can actually completely impact and drive what the industry makes by their choice, by the wallet, by their social presence, and so therefore really the system has inverted in the past few years from a system where you could only buy what was made, that was made by a limited number of manufacturers and retailers, and that's what you had to buy, no more. Now the consumers are able to absolutely change what the supply looks like by changing their demand. So that's another thing. And in particular, I just want to highlight, because that's important for later in the presentation, is we also predict that between now and 2030, so not even 2050, 60% of the middle class of the world will be in Asia, so right next to us. That's also going to impact very significantly the food system. Why would that be? Well, you all know about climate change, obviously. This is this is the group, so I won't have to argue too much about that with you. You'd be surprised, we still talk about that sometimes. There's obviously a very strong consequence of climate change on the food supply, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but you all know about the fact that if nothing is done, the prediction is that the temperature would rise 4 degrees. There are plans trying to bring it back under 2 degrees. Nonetheless, even with 2 degrees, and you think about Australia, which is a very heavy country for agriculture, you pretty much wouldn't see any of the type of cultures we have today in the agriculture around Australia with 2 degrees more. It would have to change completely. So whatever we're making and planting and harvesting today would not look at all the same by 2050 unless something changes. And that alone, just that fact alone, shows how significant the changes we're talking about, and even wrapping our mind about, how would we go about reinventing a whole food system if we don't make in 30 years what we make today. That alone is already interesting. But if you look, and I just took China as an example, China will see its arable surfaces unless something changes again. I always emphasize that. It's presenting you facts as of today with the current trends. But obviously the objective is of talking about these things as you hope will make different decisions. Unless something changes, China is going to lose a quarter of its arable surfaces, so of its agricultural land, because of temperature loss, rise and water scarcity, but also because of urbanization and wealth development. So that's a quarter of the population in the world losing a quarter of their food supply. That's going to put a strain on everybody else, I guarantee you, if nothing else also does it. So it appears that we think that the link between food and sustainability is very obvious, because the more food we have to produce, then essentially the more water we have to use, the more energy we have to use. And it seems that obviously we're going to have to invest and find technologies that allows us to produce the same amount of food with a lot less resources. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because it's not the only factor. If nothing else changes, that's a significant challenge enough to produce that much more food with the same amount of resources. The problem is there's a lot of things that go into competing for resources. And also what's quite interesting is at the moment we have the benefit of a global food production system, but we also have its drawback, because the number one resource when we are talking food supply is water. 75% of the Australian supply of water goes into our agriculture. So that's a direct correlation, if there is one. So when you start looking at producing wheat, which is, for example, in Australia, one of our major export trades, or milk, or all these kind of things, what we're actually doing is transporting water around the world. And as we look forward and as we start thinking about the consequences of climate change, water is probably the most important resource we have to look after. What that's telling us really in a nutshell, and I just pointed something else out here, potentially you can see, that's the world according to organic agriculture, meaning organic land availability. Now you can see again, Australia is disproportionately bigger according to the world. So all to say that Australia has actually a pretty important role when it comes to this question of the food supply, and whether it's a leadership role or whether it's actually directly impacting many economies because of these two factors. But the bottom line is, I guess the point of this slide is really saying it's not just about considering a global food supply and trying to figure out how we feed everybody. It's also considering that we are going to have to probably really think about local food productions, because that's not a sustainable proposition to have to not only rebalance everything, but actually take water where it's not. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in maximizing short supply or short supply chain and logistic, and really reinvigorate the sourcing of food locally. All around the world, I'm not just talking Australia in this case, right? Which it has been focused on really commodities, food commodities, and transporting them from wherever it was most economical. We need to break that thinking and start looking at starting local production of a number of the food supply element, otherwise this equation will never balance. The other challenge we have is that food is just one part, and you really, and that's another tool that's just been produced by CSIRO last year in trying to understand, right, so we have this food issue coming up. It's hard to think about it today because we talk more about obesity than we think about food scarcity. Nonetheless, if you really look at the size of the challenge, it would happen. And so to try and think about this, you look at what it's called the nexus theory, but really it's about looking at all the elements that are impacting that food production. So we talked about water, for example. As mentioned, 75% of the water goes to the food supply. So whatever decision you make around water and the systems you use and this kind of work will impact, obviously, the food system. Energy, obviously, is a rising cost, but if you apply that practically to the issue and you think about what's the number one hurdle for a lot of these local agriculture economy to be able to be more efficient and produce more food with the same amount of resource in many, many countries, it's clean, low-cost energy. There's many African countries, there's many places in the world that could probably self-sustain or actually start making more. The waste in primary production, so agriculture in those parts of the world is circa 75%. So, you can take a lot of that problem away if you start producing energy supply or give them tools that give energy supply. So the action on climate change is double impact, if that makes sense. It's not only about trying to get this energy to be climate neutral or as low carbon footprint as possible, it's probably also a critical piece to actually unlock the food supply. The other part of the puzzle is obviously where people are, what do we do with the land? And I'll just leave that thought with you as saying, I just said that the arable surfaces and so the food production opportunity is going to be one of the most critical. It's going to be impacted by climate change, and it's decreasing in many parts of the world. Yet, I would say that in terms of valuation of a piece of land, food production is probably at the bottom of that. Everything else comes first, whether it's construction, real estate, whether it's mining, or whatever it is. The problem is you can't bring it back once it's destroyed. And the world will not get any more arable surfaces ever again. So what we've got is what we've got, and we've got to make the most of it. Every time we dig into that, it reduces the potential and just makes the challenge of production harder. So that's just one piece. As you can see, a lot of the research community is trying to figure out how do you drive decision making in those things, because you might very well be very well intentioned and do a lot of great work on energy, but in doing that, impacting the water supply and therefore reducing your food production potential. So it is not as simple a decision as it appears on face value. The other thing that we obviously need to do is to try and do that before we get hit with certain of these factors. As you can see here, this is just a map showing how the yield of agricultural productivity might be impacted by climate change. So if you look at Australia, we're saying that Western Australia in particular, which is probably the biggest region in the world for wheat production, might be losing about 25% of its yield. So it's certainly not going in the right direction in this case. So it's literally looking at the regions in the world producing our agricultural commodities, and starting to say, in these parts of the world, we need to anticipate and start working much harder at some of these questions before we get hit by these changes. There's obviously a lot of different scenarios, so I probably won't go through this one, but same thing. When you start looking into the future, as I said, the CSIRO mapped about 32 different scenarios, and you have to start mapping the different opportunities. Obviously, there are solutions. I don't want you to leave out and jump off the bridge the first opportunity you have. There will be a solution. I'm actually a strong believer that research and technology will be able to provide a lot of solution. Just to digress 1 second, there is a plant in Port Augusta, South Australia, that I visited late last year, which is the biggest glass house in the world, probably, producing tomatoes 12 months around using just solar energy and seawater, and recycling 80% of it. The rest of the water is actually going in the tomatoes. So this is real technology. It's hydroponics. It's very high tech, very sophisticated. It's not GMO yet. But at the end of the day, this is the kind of things that tells you, well, there are solutions if we really want to put that. The biggest problem for a lot of these things is the value we apply to the food system, among other things. And we haven't quite, and I'm sure you have plenty of these kind of discussions, or how you change the value system so that the business community and where money goes is into this kind of developmental issue, because we see a higher value, and that's not quite the case right now. Now, nonetheless, it's probably, I don't think you can read, so I'll just point very quickly to it. Some of the world research has been about looking at, okay, so if our land is frozen, meaning we will not be getting more arable land, if anything we'll be getting less, how do we solve the problem? What do we have to do in order to get the yields or the production of food to the level we need for meeting this population? And essentially, there's a lot of things that can be done, as I mentioned earlier, just by also enabling a lot of the countries that do not have access to good energy or good practices to actually start getting that. That alone could make a massive difference. It's about 70% of the food supply that's still produced today by farming communities. So that's still the major way of production for food. If you go in India, 700 million people in India live off the land, literally. So that's still the majority of the population in the world. So we need to equip them as they start evolving their wealth with the right tools so that they don't create a gap, they actually manage with their local resources. So that's still the biggest opportunity. GMO, I'm afraid at one point or another we're going to have to talk about it. So the researchers, they just run for cover as soon as we start mentioning genetics because they know what the population thinks in general is. We don't want to hear about it. Yet, with the whole situation I just showed you, it's unlikely we'll find a solution. This is a WWF slide. So you can't think that these guys are biased, and yet they still have GMO as the #1 solution to food hunger in the long term. So obviously there's plenty of things that need to be done with that, but that's still a pretty big thing. Then there is technologies, things like, I just mentioned, things like hydroponics. The Netherlands is the second producer of agriculture in the world, on a country the size of a quarter of Melbourne. They're the #2 exporter in the world behind the US. They produce about, I think it's I'm going to say a wrong number, but never mind, something like 50 to 100 times more per hectare than anyone else in the world. And you know how they do that? Glass houses. It's a country covered with glass houses. And so there is technology. It's not necessarily robots. It's not necessarily things we're thinking is going to produce, food like in the Matrix that we don't actually want to eat. It's real food. It's just done in a way that's so optimized that it uses, 15 times less resources than anybody else would for the same thing. It's going to be very hard in the next 5 years to start finding tomatoes that are not grown in hydroponics or glasshouse, I can tell you that, if only by the economics. Which is a good thing, if you ask me, but we then have underperforming land, that's what we were talking about, again, that's these kind of things. And then we start tapping into these two small pieces, and they are important because they start dealing with the people side, and us starting to acknowledge that in the future we will have to change how we treat food or our relation to food in order for the future generation to have their food supply balance. And that starts with two things that we will talk about just now: overconsumption, and overconsumption of certain type of foods, which we will hear far more later, and then waste. So it's really starting with saying, before we even go into Star Trek and how we might zap a button and get a chicken out of a microwave or those kind of new technology, there's plenty we can do today. Food waste is probably, and I'm sure you've all seen some of the thing on the news or some of the documentaries on this, etc., but it's astounding when you really look at some of the figures. So we waste collectively in the world the equivalent of what the population of Mexico eats, so globally. That's, $1,600 billion worth of food, and 24% of the total calories ever produced just go to waste. Now, in developed countries or established countries like Australia, most of that occurs at the consumer end, us. It's about 40-50% in total by the time you put everything together, whether it's because we want the perfect tomatoes and the perfect bananas, and therefore anything else gets wasted before it even reaches us, or because we want everything available at every time in the year, and therefore, to supply that, the supply system makes sure that you have that at all time, which means it creates a lot of haulage and waste along the way. In the developing country, as I was mentioning, because of the lack of logistic and supply and technology, 50% is wasted at the origin point. So whether it's crops that are just wasted on the land and can't be transported or refrigerated, so they get wasted. But it is a very significant factor. I think the average is a third, roughly, if you want to remember something, of anything we produce don't get eaten one way or the other. So there's plenty already there in terms of solving the longer term problems, I guess. Again, there will be technologies working through this technology and solutions, but it probably starts as well with the consumer end and starting to change some of the practices. The other thing is, and I know we still think that there are people that are malnourished, and that's still the case, but just like economic growth has taken a lot of people out of poverty, we've taken a lot of the people out of the world in hunger. The problem is we don't stop. So the problem is by 2050, this is actually people eating, so just so you can see, I don't know if you can see at the back, but literally people in red at the bottom here are people who don't eat 2,000 calories a day, right? And it's predicted by 2030, no one will be like that. And then that touch of green is what you'd consider a normal diet, between 2 and 2,500 kilocalories a day. You can see that by 2030, only that amount of people are having a normal diet. Then we get to between 2,500 and 3,000, which is normally, a high-performing athlete just before a game, probably, something like that. And then you've got the rest. So I'll just let you imagine what that means, but we are above 3,000 calories a day per capita. It's not necessarily quantity, it's what we eat. This is where we get into the discussion about meat. This is where we get into high fat. This is where we get into high sugar, all these kind of things. But the question and the problem is, as you can see, we're just also contributing to the problem, and obviously all the health consequences that you can imagine that go with that. So there is here again another thing that we can start working through and coming in. So if I go through all of that, it's actually demonstrated that with all these different solutions I just talked about, we believe that most of the growth, the gap of the arable land created by the climate change in particular can be overcome. But it will take things like, and I won't talk too much about it because Mark is going to talk more about consumption of protein, but if we don't change what we're doing, as you can see, between 1970 and 2030, we will have seen 150% increase in animal protein consumption globally. And that's availability, wealth, and then obviously habits. That is one of the critical issues for the food supply, which I'll simply associate for you to water footprint. It's that simple. As you can see, you need 460 liters of water for a kilogram of beef versus 650 for a kilogram of barley. So if water is at the center of our food supply issue and we need to figure things out, one of the things we can do is actually start rebalancing how much meat we eat and relearn to be more vegetarians, even if it's not our complete diet. The other piece that is also predicted, just to let you have a look at that, is the importance, obviously, of fish and seafood. And the prediction is about 2/3 of it will have to go through raised farming, so not sea farming, obviously, because that won't be it's not only bad for the environment to go and fish out of the sea, but it's also obviously never sufficient for the amount of protein we want to get out of fish in the balance. So again, a large investment hopefully in fish farming. So the last few things I'll leave you with is there are plenty of reasons why we want to do this. Obviously, there's plenty of opportunities in there to shift what we eat, to shift the technology we invest in to actually be able to produce and resolve the food supply. But it's also a pretty important issue when it comes to health. And there's a lot of research going into, and I wouldn't be a big surprise, but there's a lot of demonstrated research going these days into what we call personalized nutrition. The fact that through an adapted diet that corresponds to your genomes, your environmental factors, what might be certain of your personal issues, you can impact your health tremendously positively through an adapted nutrition. So I am a big believer that we'll see a lot of that permeate food supply, come through. It will solve a few of these supply issues, but more importantly, it will have a positive impact on health. So probably the biggest nascent science in this particular part is gut health and microbiota, and now we're rediscovering a lot of impact that not feeding our microbiota the right balance of nutrients has created a lot of problems with allergies, a lot of problems of obviously overweight and a number of these conditions. It's all demonstrated already that even conditions like autism for children can be managed or can be avoided with proper nutrition on the microbiota. So I'm a big believer that if nothing else turns some of our practices to something that will become more sustainable at the macro level for consumption, health will. And so we should see a lot more of that coming through. We talked about that, so I won't, but there was another graphic representation just to demonstrate why we believe that technology will be a big part of the solution with the food supply. Things that we don't think are possible today. You know, you just look at the curve of acceleration of technology disruption, and it's quite massive. Now, it needs to go directly to solve the problem. And so where you're going to see technology in terms of helping with this food supply are essentially these big research territory. So precision agriculture, which is helping a lot of the farming community in the world to adopt and adapt a lot of the latest technology to help them figure out how they get the best out of their yields. So this is obviously using a lot of digital technology and satellites and a number of these things, but making that broadly available. Through to water irrigation technique, hydroponics is an example that I used, but there'll be plenty more of that because water is the key currency for supply. GMO we discussed, solar energy because that's going to be again the key for food supply, and bio-based fuel once again also because it enables a lot of low income farming communities to derive a much better way of living, therefore considering again agriculture as a critical piece in the fabric of the countries. That's just one I put in because it just gives you a very good view about where the world is evolving in terms of population over time. We are at 2020 now and growing to 2030 and 2040. And so it shows you that over the next 10 years, the evolution towards Asia is continuing, and then Africa will take over for the following 10 to 20 years. So it's a very critical piece of the puzzle to understand that we need to solve also the local problem of food supply in those parts of the world in order to not disbalance what's going to happen in us. But probably this is one final piece of the puzzle, is where we hope and believe that if consumers start shifting their habits and drive the system to go elsewhere, we also think that there's a massive economic opportunity for the country in terms of exporting both technology and produce around the world. So if nothing else will do it, money might eventually derive the right changes into the system. At the end of the day, that's probably the think it's my last slide, but at the end of the day, these are the two things we believe we're going to need and we're going to see happening. An enormous focus on increasing the food supply, the yields, taking care of the land and the water, and so seeing a lot of anticipation on what might happen in parts of our country, and therefore what infrastructure investment might be required to cope with that. And at the other end, driven by consumers such as us, is through changing our habits, actually impacting the food system to adapt to a more sustainable future. I think that's it for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. I don't know how you feel, but I'm pleased I will be here in 2050. Oh yeah, I think so. Well, I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, but we wait after the second presentation where we have a Q&A session. Okay, now let me introduce our second speaker, Mr. Mark Doneddu. Mark is president of Vegetarian Victoria. He's also a co-founder and director of World Vegan Day, and I think we are quite happy tonight to have the second founder, I think, Philip Wallen, here with us. So this event, World Vegan Day in Melbourne, is a very successful event that was created in 2003. And this event continues to grow, attracting thousands of people every year. And I think it might be November this year or something?
It's actually October the 14th.
Oh, October the 14th. Excellent, thank you. So Mark first became vegetarian nearly 30 years ago, and then vegan about, I think, 4 years later.
Yep.
And so Mark has had an extensive researching vegan health issue, experience researching vegan health issue. As a result, he is highly sought after speaker, having spoken at many major events around the country, and he still regularly presents talks on health and nutrition on behalf of Vegetarian Victoria. He has also given interviews on many popular radio stations, such as the ABC and Radio National, to name a few, as well as newspapers like The Age and The Herald Sun. So Vegetarian Victoria is a website that I would advise you to visit, particularly for its excellent 9-page brochure called Eating of the World, the Health Consequences of Human Food Choices. So I strongly recommend you read it. Now please join me in welcoming Mark Doneddu.
Thank you very much. Well, we heard a really great presentation by Nicolas just a little bit earlier about how we've got some very major challenges that we're facing in the near future. And the fact that we're going to have 70% more people to feed means that we're going to have to think very, very smart about what we're going to do. And we're going to have to do things differently. And it's great that we've got this new technology that is going to help us. And I was quite staggered that in the Netherlands that they're about 100 times more efficient at producing food than what we are over here, for example. And things like greenhouses are going to be a big part of that. But how we think about food is also very, very important as well. And hopefully this presentation that I'm going to go through will give you some idea about maybe questioning some of our thoughts that we have about food and what food is the best for us in the future, not only for the environment but for our health as well. And this presentation will go through that step by step. So what I'll firstly talk about is the Eating Up the World. Now, it was mentioned that we have this available on our VegBig website, and we have two versions of this book. We have an environmental book and a health booklet. Now, this environmental booklet, we've distributed 180,000 of them around Australia, and it's actually helped many people change their food habits and actually switch to a plant-based diet. Now, I'll just briefly touch on some of the things that's in this booklet. Well, one of the most staggering things is that, apart from the United States, that we're seeing more species destruction in this continent of Australia than anywhere else in the world. And one big reason for that is because of the type of food that we're choosing to grow in this country, namely animal food and cattle and sheep production. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in the previous presentation was about water usage. Now, there are many figures going around about how much water it actually takes to produce different types of foods. Now, this particular figure that we're actually using, This figure that we're using here for beef is 50,000 litres to produce a kilo of beef. Now that particular one came from Dr. Wayne Meyer from the CSIRO, and he actually said it was anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 litres of water, whereas potatoes was, the lowest one there, only about 500 litres by comparison. Now there are other ways of looking at it, and I'll go through that a little bit later and why some of the figures are a little bit different. But nonetheless, it's about 100 times more water to produce beef compared to plant food. And there was a great report by a lady called Sang in Melbourne University that actually said that direct household water use is only a fraction of the total water that we actually use in our diet, which is mainly from animal foods. And it was mentioned that water usage is a real issue for us at the moment, and 77% of our agricultural water goes into animal industries, whether it's for beef, lamb production, chicken production, and also dairy and egg production as well. So that's quite a significant amount. Now, in the United States, they actually use a different figure, which is about 2,500 gallons of water to produce a pound of beef. And the main difference over there is that they mainly have grain-fed cattle over there, and grain-fed cattle tend to use a lot less water, mainly because you're not relying on such evaporation that you have in a lot of Australian land areas. And so it effectively equates to about 20,000 litres of water needed to produce a kilo of beef. Now, interestingly, if you look at the beef checkoff, they would tell you that it's as low as 441 gallons per pound. Now, why is that figure so different to 2,500? And the main reason is that one of them is actually looking at the water that goes into the feed. Now, in the United States, the majority of the cattle are actually grain-fed, and that grain requires a lot of water. Now, in fact, if you have a look, just to sort of spell it out, how we got that figure, if you have a look at corn, it takes 150 gallons per litre to get corn. Now, soy is a lot more. It's 257 gallons per pound. And it takes 6 pounds of feed in order to get 1 pound of gain of beef. And of the beef that's actually produced, only about half of it is eaten, specifically 55% is actually consumed. And so by using this equation, it comes out to about 1,800 gallons per pound. And that's not including the water that the animals drink and the water used in the production in the slaughterhouse and so forth, in cleaning operations. And when you consider that, then it gets up to that 2,500 figure. Now, there's a lot of solutions that have been bandied about how we can save water, and one of the most common things that we're told, if we listen to our government agencies, they tell us to switch to low-flow showerheads. Now, I've done that myself, and I think it's great. Everyone should try and save water where we can. But the amount of water saved per year is significant. It's somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 litres. But when you remove animal products such as that's a burger, milk, cheese and eggs, and you take them out of your diet, you save a whopping 840,000 litres of water. Now that is incredibly significant. Now even if this was only half of that, it's still an absolutely amazing amount of water. Now, in that environmental booklet, we talk about air, and we talk about greenhouse gases. And what's interesting is how a lot of this information about animal industries has first sort of come to light. And what I will first of all talk about before I go into too much detail is I want to sort of shadow one of the myths that goes around at the moment, where there are people like Alan Savory telling us that we can have short duration grazing or holistic management, where we have a whole lot of cattle bunched together and they can go around huge amounts of land, and then they can sequester a lot of carbon, and so rather than hurting the environment, they're actually helping the environment. Well, that's what he would have you believe. However, when he's actually sort of asked that question, where do you get your sources for that? And The Guardian asked him fairly recently, he wasn't able to actually cite any studies for that. It was all totally anecdotal information. Because in actual fact, when they've actually put it to the test, the amount of carbon that's sequestered is only 1/8 of what he actually claims. and also fails to mention that you have a huge amount of greenhouse emissions that are emitted by the cattle, and what's sequestered by the soil is only a tiny fraction of that. And you can see that grain-fed cattle actually eliminate a lot, release a lot less greenhouse emissions by comparison to grass-fed cattle. And you can see all the other types of ways of using the soil are far more effective as far as sequestering carbon, in particular exceptional vegetable farming, which is something that we're going to have to do a lot more of, using a lot of technology on how to do that even better. But even just something simple like having worms in the soil certainly sequesters a lot more carbon compared to this short duration grazing that people like Alan Savory are actually recommending. Now, the CSIRO was mentioned a bit earlier, but also there's a world organisation as part of the United Nations called the Food and Agriculture Organisation, and they came up with a report called Livestock's Long Shadow. And in 2006 they said that 18% of global greenhouse emissions were caused by animal industries. And that was quite shocking at the time, because that was actually more than all of the world's transport. So you can have a greater influence on greenhouse emissions purely by eliminating a lot of your animal foods. Now, a few years later, in 2009, we had a much more shocking report, which came from this climate change report, Livestock and Climate Change, by the World Watch Institute. And that was a group that worked in conjunction with the World Bank to actually look at all levels of causes of greenhouse emissions and factor them all into the equation. And what they actually found was that there was a lot more tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent released than what the Food and Agriculture Organisation had previously said. In fact, they said it was up to 51%. Now, to see where the differences actually come from, they basically showed some interesting kind of discrepancies in the FAO report, Livestock's Long Shadow. They found that they were using figures from much earlier in time instead of when the report was released in 2006. They also found that there was a discrepancy between the figures they used for chicken, which I think was 30 billion, compared to other figures that they had released, which was closer to 80 billion. And they made the same mistake when it came to cattle as well. They understated that dramatically, and also refused to look at the respiration by livestock, because they said that that's just a natural part of our ecosystem, and so we shouldn't consider it. But it's like saying that cars are a natural part of our ecosystem because we've created them as well, like we have cattle. But that would be ludicrous to say that, and yet by doing that you can actually understate the amount of greenhouse emissions dramatically. The other thing that they also did is they considered the amount of methane and the effect over a 20-year period is much more significant, can up to be 72 to 83 times more powerful than CO2. Now, instead of using it over the 100 years like the Livestock's Longer Shadow had done, they believe that 20 years is more significant because we're having a problem with climate change right now. In 100 years' time, we may not even be here the way we're going. So we really need to look in the shorter term, and a lot of scientists believe the 20-year period is more significant. So all up, that's how they actually came up with those particular figures. And to sort of summarise the difference, they actually said that the key difference between the 18% and the 51% figures is that the latter accounts for how exponential growth in the livestock production, now more than 60 billion land animals per year, accompanied by large-scale deforestation and forest burning, have caused a dramatic decline in the Earth's photosynthetic capacity, along with large and increasingly accelerating increases in volatilization of soil carbon. So, you know, we can see that that really caused a major jump in how much greenhouse emissions you're actually releasing with animal industries. Now, in 2013, the World Health Organisation, or the Food and Agriculture Organisation, had a chance to update their figures, and instead of having 18%, they've actually gone down to 14.5%, which caused a lot of shockwaves. And when you actually understand why that happens, why they continue to overlook a lot of these glaring things that they shouldn't have been ignored, you can see that they teamed up with the International Meat Secretariat, and they also teamed up with the International Dairy Federation. And as has been said many times, I think it was Lord Upton, as Philip Wallen actually mentions, it's a bit hard to convince someone of something when their livelihood depends on them not understanding it. And this is what's happening, I think, with this particular organisation. And they're ignoring a lot of the biggest causes of greenhouse emissions. Now, to put it in another way, one hamburger produces 75 kilograms of carbon dioxide, and that's the equivalent of driving a car around for 3 weeks. So that's a very significant reduction in greenhouse emissions just there by avoiding having one hamburger. Now, to put it another way, the carbon footprint by diet, you can see a high meat diet is about 15.8. And then as you have less and less meat, you go to vegetarian, and finally vegan is only 6.4. So that's a dramatic improvement just there. And you hear often, you know, a lot about these new technologies and about trying to do what we can to get away from fossil fuels. And I'm all for that. Anything that we can do to get away from fossil fuels, using solar, using all this technology, I think we need to do more and more of that. But it's estimated that it will take over 20 years to eliminate all these fossil fuels and all of the industries and infrastructure around that, and $43 trillion. And I've got a whole stack of studies here which can show where those figures actually came from. And then people say to me that, oh, well, you know, I want to go vegan, but it's very expensive. Well, you know, what's interesting is that a vegan diet can be very, very cheap. You know, if you go to a store, it can cost $14 for a kilogram of beef, and $2 for a kilogram of sweet potato. And then people say, oh yeah, but they're not the same. You know, beef is more nutritious. It's got more nutrients and so forth. But in actual fact, I'll show you later through some studies that the opposite is the case. There are people in Okinawa that have been eating sweet potato their whole lives from about 1910 up to about 1980, and they were some of the longest living people in the world. And in fact, one family that just ate nothing but sweet potato, their average lifespan was 115 years of age. So you can see that eating sweet potato certainly wasn't doing them a lot of harm. Now, when you have a look at land usage, we've lost something like 92% of our land that's been degraded because of animal industries. A lot of our rainforest and bushland. You know that I've spoken to some landowners in Gippsland, and they were telling me that about 100 to 150 years ago, farmers were told to make the land productive. And what that meant was they had to just basically burn all of the bushland, all of the forest in their property, so that eventually it could be used for grazing cattle. And it's one of the biggest problems that we actually have. And this is also in that booklet of Heating Up the World. And you know, we talk about how we're also polluting a lot of the waterways because of the animal industries. You know, we had a situation in South Carolina a number of years ago where one of the lagoons for a piggery overflowed and actually killed so many fish in the nearby lake that it actually killed more fish than the Exxon Valdez accident from 1989 was responsible for. And yet everyone remembers the Exxon Valdez accident, but very few people actually even know that of the destruction caused by that particular animal industry. Now, it's not just Australia that's affected by cattle. Have a look at this is a particular report looking at the Amazon. 80% of the Amazon is caused by the deforestation is caused by grazing of cattle. And then we've got another one here, which says it's something up to 91%. Now, this actually comes from a film called Cowspiracy. Can I have a show of hands who's actually seen that film, Cowspiracy? Yeah, quite a significant number of people. And that had quite a lot of very interesting stats, which I'll just quickly summarise. One of them was quite shocking, was that a farm with 2,500 dairy cows produces the same waste as a city of 411,000 people. That's like a city of Miami. The people there would produce the same waste as only 2,500 dairy cows. It's quite shocking. And what about this one? 1.5 acres can produce 37,000 pounds of plant food, and yet 1.5 acres can produce only 375 pounds of meat. So as Einstein said, we can't solve the problems that we have today with the same level of thinking that created them. We need a different level of thinking, and we need a different type of solution. And I think that we definitely need to consider what sort of food we are actually growing. Now, in the booklet we also talk about the ocean and about how overfishing is a severe problem at the moment. And in fact, we've lost something like 90% of our fish since 1950, and at this rate we're going to lose all of our fish by 2047. Now, interestingly, a lot of people are talking about factory farm fish as a solution to this. But what people don't realise is that it takes 5 kilograms of wild fish produced to only achieve 1 kilogram of this factory farm fish. And these factory farm fishes are causing a lot of problems in the ocean now. A lot of antibiotics are being fed to these fish because they're getting sicker and sicker, being in such a confined area. And some of these fish are used to swimming hundreds of miles a day. You can't even swim any distance at all now, and they're getting so many diseases now that are now being passed on to other fish, wild fish outside of those fish farms. And this also talks about the amount of energy that goes into producing animal foods, which is far higher, obviously, with animal foods compared to plant foods. And the grain that we feed cattle is enough to feed 8.7 billion people, more than the world's entire population. And then we have a lot of studies there that back up that data. Now, I have to also touch on the health consequences of a plant-based diet, and that's why we brought out this booklet, because a lot of people say, yes, intellectually it makes sense, yeah, we need to cut our greenhouse emissions and eat less meat, but we need to have protein, and we need to have good quality sources of calories. So I just thought that I'll show you this booklet. Now this I can actually give out to everyone here in the audience, also the environmental booklet for anyone who wants a copy. They're given out free by VegVic or Vegetarian Victoria. And one of the things that we actually talk about here is obesity, and how Australia now is up there with the United States as having one of the highest rates of obesity, and it's getting worse and worse. And we're having all of these other preventable illnesses, mainly because of the food that we're eating. And there was a book a number of years ago called The China Study that actually looked at 880 million people over about a 30-year time frame, and they found that the areas that were consuming the most animal foods had the highest rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, most of these common diseases that we have today. And what's also interesting is that when you have a look at body mass index, that, and this is a trend that you find worldwide, that you find that meat eaters are always heavier than the flexitarians, heavier than the vegetarians, and the vegans are always got the lowest body mass index. And this data was from the United States, which is the country that has the highest rate of obesity of anywhere in the world. And you can see the vegans are the only group that is under that 25 BMI for a healthy range. And what's also interesting is that here the vegans will basically have the same BMI as endurance runners, and obviously the people on the Western diet were much higher. But the difference between being an endurance runner, while you might have the same body mass index, is that if you're eating meat, you also have a higher range of IGF-1. Now, IGF-1 is the insulin growth factor 1 that has been shown that's in animal products that severely increases cancer rates quite dramatically. So that's significant that a plant-based diet can certainly reduce those levels. And of course, the plant-based diet has far lower levels of cholesterol. And this one's interesting because this shows people on a plant-based diet in Kenya actually, as they get older, their blood pressure diminishes, actually gets lower. We think that as you get older, that a natural consequence is your blood pressure is going to go up. It's not the case. When you have these plant foods that actually give flexibility to your endothelium and your arterial walls, you actually have a lower blood pressure as you get older. And eating plant-based foods is one of the best ways to achieve that. And here we talk about Okinawa. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And that's one of the populations that has one of the highest longevities in the world. People think, oh, they must eat a lot of fish. Well, in actual fact, fish is left the 1% of their diet, and 97% of their diet is plant-based. And sweet potato comprises about 70% of the food that they actually eat. And they thrive on a plant-based diet. In fact, a documentary made on them actually said, well, don't you get sick of just eating fruits and vegetables every day? That was what the comment they made of the Okinawanans. And as good as they are, there's one group that outlives them, and that is the Seventh-day Adventist in California, Loma Linda. And they're on a diet that's most either vegetarian or vegan. And the vegans in the group can live up to 15 years more than the average American that's got a lifespan of 74. And they outlive the vegetarians by about 5 years, and the vegetarians outlive the meat eaters by 10 years. So it's quite a significant finding there. Now, when people say you need protein on a plant-based diet, well, have a look at Carl Lewis. He ran faster when he switched to a vegan diet than he did when he was much younger in his 20s. You've got people like Mac Danzig. You've got Kendrick Farris. He was the only representative for the United States in the Olympics in weightlifting, and he was the only one who was vegan as well. So it just goes to show. Yes, the Williams sisters also on a plant-based diet. Scott Jurek, ultra-marathon champion on a plant-based diet. Martina Navratilova won a Grand Slam at the age of nearly 50 on a plant-based diet. And I'll just touch on this. There's a population in Uganda in the 1950s that Dennis Burkitt first discovered, and he found that not one of them had heart disease in the whole population. In the meantime, 1 in 2 Americans were dying of heart disease. And the first case of heart disease they saw in Uganda was a judge that had spent time in England, had developed a taste for meat and dairy and eggs, went to Uganda, had a heart attack, and they didn't know what to do with this guy. So they had to ring the General Hospital in New York, and I said, what do we do? And I said, that's a common procedure. You get a circular saw, you cut open the breastbone, you expose the aorta, which is clogged with animal fat and cholesterol. Then you just grab an artery from the leg, you then you graft it on, redirect the blood flow, and that should keep him going until his next heart attack in another 5 years or 10 years' time, when the cholesterol and animal fat builds up again. Now, at that point, they said, well, wouldn't it be easier to just switch to a plant-based diet? And they said, what, a vegan diet? That's a bit extreme, isn't it? And what they've also found is that when they looked at that population, their cholesterol in American numbers was about 139. Now, in Australia, that's somewhere between 3 and 3.5, which is very low. In fact, some people say that's too low, but in actual fact, that's what the healthy people are actually doing. Having a normal cholesterol in a country where it's normal to drop dead of a heart attack is not a good thing. You want optimum cholesterol. And Colwell Esselstyn found it. He never found one person with heart disease with cholesterol under 150. And that should be the healthy cholesterol, not 200 like they say in the United States. And this is the biggest cause of death, which is thrombosis, where you have a cholesterol build-up like that, and you have a cholesterol crystal form, often tearing the arterial wall of the endothelium, leading to a blockage. And what they found when they did autopsies of people that died of heart disease is that they compared them to people of the same age who died of something else. If those people had these cholesterol crystals that had crystallized in there. And this is what they actually found. They found that they turned into a solid crystallized state. And so in a test tube, you can see this, where you form a crystal, and those crystals are sharp under a microscope. They look like razors, and they can actually tear your arterial wall and cause a blood clot and cause death. And that's what they found in every person that died of acute heart attacks. They had these cholesterol crystals, whereas someone who died of something else didn't have them. And that's what happens when you eat a lot of animal foods. And now this is showing what arteriosclerosis looks like. That's someone who's on a diet of meat, dairy and eggs, and you can see this is someone on a plant-based diet, and you can see how it's clean. And what's interesting is people that die of Alzheimer's, they do autopsies of them, and they find that their brains are about half the size, because much of the brain matter has died off. Whereas healthy people who died of something else, but say a car accident of the same age, they had very, very clean arteries, and all of the blood vessels leading to the brain were clogged like that on an Alzheimer's patient, whereas the people who didn't die of Alzheimer's had blood vessels that look like that. So you can see that Alzheimer's is largely a disease of too much animal products. Yes, there are things like inflammation which can lead to it as well. It can also cause a narrowing of the arteries. But the biggest source of inflammation also happens to be animal foods as well. And this is Patrick Bamumia, the strongest man in the world, who lifted 550 kilograms above his head. and it proved that you certainly don't need meat to eat protein. There's no man stronger than that. And in fact, 550 kilograms is more than the crush strength of your spine. The reason he's able to do that and other athletes would never attempt such a thing is because he has really good blood flow going to every one of those thousands of little capillaries leading to the spine, which gives him huge strength. Whereas if that's blocked, you don't have the strength in the muscles, you don't have the oxygen and blood going to those muscles, and nor do you have the nutrients going to the spine. And so the vertebrae aren't going to be as strong. Whereas Patrick certainly didn't have that problem. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger is telling you don't need to eat meat to be strong, and he says you don't build muscle in the kitchen, you build it in the gym. And as long as you're eating anti-inflammatory foods like plant foods, you can do much better. We get plenty of protein. You can see there vegans, vegetarians, meat eaters, they all get about the same protein generally. And in fact, when they did a study, vegans versus meat eaters, they actually found that when they looked at the blood plasma, the vegans had more protein in their plasma than meat eaters. Excuse me. And one of the reasons was that inflammation actually reduces the amount of available protein that you have, which is probably why some of the strongest men in the world tend to be vegans. And instead of asking you, where do you get your protein from, what they should be asking is where do you get your fibre from? Only less than 3% of Americans get enough fibre. And is fibre important? Yes, and in fact it's been described as probably the most important nutrient. Yes, that's right. Fibre is not just something that cleans you up and removes toxins out of the body, but rather it's also something that is a nutrient for the good gut bacteria. And that was mentioned a little bit earlier in the previous talk, that having healthy gut bacteria is key for good health. It helps reduce inflammation through butyrate production, and improves the ability to deal with infections and so forth. And it's been shown that the more high fibre you have, the better off you are. Now, have a look at this age groups here, everywhere from about 14 up to 50. In the United States, virtually none of them were getting enough fibre. And so that's a real major problem. And according to many researchers, it's been described as probably the most important nutrient that there is, being responsible for so many illnesses and diseases that it can help reverse. Now, I think I'm probably just about going over time, but I've got much more of this information on a video that I've got that goes for 100 minutes. It talks specifically just on the health benefits. Also touches a little bit on the environmental aspects as well, which I have available for $10. But I also have some free booklets of the Eating Up the World, which everyone is free to take. So I think at this point I might just conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I hope you are all convinced. You are going to clean your fridge tonight. Okay, so we're going to start the Q&A sessions. So we're going to have a mic.
Then they just bring the two speakers out.
Yeah, the two speakers here, and we're going to have a mic that I can bring to you. So, maybe you should be closer here so I can, yeah? So I can take the other line to the people. So, who want to start? Yeah? Do you want this? Or maybe it's for? So it's on.
The question for Nicolas.
Sorry.
Is any country looking at reducing population, apart from the one-child policy in China, which we know is finished? That would be another way to look at it.
My wife always says, we'll probably have a war anyway, so don't worry. So, no one's actually looked at the effect of reducing population. And I think the only part of the world that for a long time was going negative was Africa. And you've seen from my graph that it's going back the other way around. Obviously that was a consequence of AIDS in particular. Yeah. Yeah, it's going down because they're only at 1.2 child per couple or something like that, so it is going down. But I think fundamentally it's really starting by looking at
the amount of diet, the amount of food you are actually consuming, and that's still going to be the number one factor. Regardless whether population goes up or down, I think we're already in unsustainable territory anyway. So I think that would be the first port of call, is to start looking at reducing consumption. That would be the very first thing.
Yeah.
Can we? Hi. Great talks. Thank you very much. I was doing some work on the energy side a while ago, and I was quite surprised at the very large energy and environmental impacts of fertiliser. And so I was just interested, because I didn't look at it very carefully, but can you tell us a bit about the scale of those effects for climate change and water environmental?
Yeah, I think the main thing is it's actually soil nutrition. It's the impact that it has on yields. A lot of these yields have been maintained artificially through the use of heavy use of fertilizer. But what you find over time is that it actually starts to first stabilize and then start going down in terms of yield per hectare. So it's almost like as you deplete the soil nutrition, it's very similar to, we were just talking about gut health. It's a very similar logic actually with, as you start depleting your own bacteria, but same with land, it becomes harder and harder to actually produce the same amount. So it becomes just an ever increasing addition of fertilizer. So basically what's happening is we're essentially depleting the soil life. Now, if you ask a lot of the agriculture community, you'll always find 50-50. For them, some of them are convinced of that, and there's a lot of people switching back to not just organic but biodynamic. You would have heard about biodynamic, and it's hard to get back to that, but when you're there, you actually get better yields than anybody else, which proves the point. And then the other half, which, because the transition is very complicated and long, tend to actually just constantly look for the next product. But fundamentally, yes, it would have also a significant impact. I think water will always have a much bigger impact. So, but if you think about that, you probably still have, if 80% of the impact is due to water, you still have 20% due to soil nutrition, so it's still significant.
Right, thanks from the microphone.
Just, I guess, expressing
A concern about the control of agriculture by large agribusiness. Just concerned that if we greatly increase the technology, perhaps we could end up with just more huge monocultures, and also I'm concerned that some of these companies will be deciding what food we eat, and also
I'm just concerned that we will lose control over what we eat and what seeds we are able to plant, and also that other countries are buying a great deal of our agricultural land. Maybe it'll become the policy of another country as to what we can or will grow in Australia or anywhere else for that matter.
Well, probably just a comment more than, I think the first thing, and I hope at least I conveyed that point, was for many, at least 2 years ago, it was just something I heard, or if you want, I didn't realize how much our food supply was at stake over the next period. So I think if nothing else, it is truly about how we put that back up in our list of priority, and land, and all the type of issues you're talking about is, to me, the problem at the moment is more that we see that number 10 in the list. So there's a whole bunch of other things before we even get to talk about this. So
all of those things might happen. My point of view, if I'm honest, is you also need a portfolio of solutions in general to actually be able to tackle that kind of problem. So we will need high-tech solutions, we will need very low-tech solutions, we'll need to hold on to the land we have, that is food production. That's probably the most important things we can do in the shorter term, in whatever shape or form that may take. But I think it's really about how that becomes a critical part of the agenda. And I think the thing we haven't found globally, I don't think there's a lot of discussions about that, is how do you put the value system to, which is currently money, how do we put it in a place where these kind of critical long-term issues has enough value for that to drive to the right conclusions, whereas currently it may very well happen, we may very well find good solutions, we may very well have great policies that will protect all this, but it'll probably be more by chance than by design. So it becomes the question of how we put that around. But
I guess my concern is that economics will call the shots.
That's right. So this is why I think, that's what my point was about. We have to change the value system, and I think that's part of what Mark talks about.
Government interference, because economics is for profit and for destruction.
Yes.
Government has to control it, we have to input in it. What can we do?
I think we need to realise that we're facing some very, very major crises right at the moment. We're losing some of our water. The greenhouse emissions are going to be a major problem for us, and so rather than just economic benefits, we should be really looking at what's for our long-term survival, what's vital. Now, one of the problems is that a lot of the economic benefits that people think they're getting from animal industries are only there because they've been artificially inflated by the subsidies that the governments have been giving them. You know that a lot of cattle farmers don't pay for the water that they're using on their land, and yet we've got the Murray-Darling now is drying up, for example, and most of the water is going for the animal agriculture. If we were to penalise these industries appropriately, then you'll find that it would no longer be economically viable, and we'd have a very different equation that we'd be looking at. In the United States, it's actually cheaper to buy a hamburger than it is to buy an apple, and that's because of the massive subsidies that the US government is giving to the animal industries. So we definitely need, as a people, to demand that our politicians stop, effectively subsidising these very inefficient industries.
There is a question here. I'm a student of agriculture, and I think that one of the most serious concerns is in our power, it is where we shop. And we have seen large companies screwing down the farmers and also making it difficult for us to shop. And it's reached a climax in Elsternwick at the moment. I notice there's one food shop open, and that is a fresh vegetable shop, and the large shop which was there has decided to renovate. So it doesn't care what happens to everyone else who might have needed to buy a bag of flour or something. We've also got to look at saying potatoes are good. But I have read that women in Ireland had to dig 6.5 pounds of potatoes or 3 kilos of potatoes in round figures to give the same nutrition. So we've got to be very careful of that. I'd also say that I know of industry at Ballarat which is enabling people to produce more meat very effectively at 30% higher rate than it cost before. They have worked out how to stimulate animal production, and they have really reduced the grain production. So we've got to really encourage people here rather than continually allow large companies to dominate. And, in Elsternwick, if you didn't have a car, you'd probably starve, or if you weren't capable of catching a tram or train. So we've really seen the extent that large food shops are prepared to go to disregard the needs of people. There's one vegetable shop in Elsternwick where you can buy fresh food now. And I'm very concerned about that attitude.
If I can just answer that. I think one of the big problems is that the consumers basically have a lot more power than we give ourselves credit to. One of the reasons why a lot of these big conglomerates have taken over to the extent that they have, and we allow those practices to occur, is because we as consumers, we support them with our dollars. Now, if we were to not do that and say buy locally grown organic produce, then we would have a very different result. Then those businesses would have to move into that area. So we've really got ourselves to blame to a large extent for that. But just going on about what you said about the potatoes, that group in Okinawa were the longest living people in the world. 70% of their diet is sweet potato. Now, that's a complete food. It contains all of the nutrients that you need. And as the statistics showed, that you actually have greater protein levels on a plant-based diet than you have on a meat-based diet. And not only that, when they compare who's more deficient in nutrients, they actually found that meat eaters are more deficient, in particular in vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin C, on folate, fibre, a whole magnesium, a whole range of things. And vegans were only deficient in only a handful of things by comparison. So a plant-based diet is a lot healthier than people give it credit for. And if people ate that, I think you'll find a lot of our problems would tend to go away.
A couple of very brief points. To address the gentleman's question from behind, we've just come back from Africa and the Middle East, South America, and China, and we had with us a whole bunch of our groups that we support, including the Chinese. And the Chinese bureaucrats described how they were buying up millions and millions of acres, or leasing it, of land in these countries, South America, Africa, the Middle East, etc. And I said, you're doing the same in Australia. And they laughed and they said, yes, in China we call Africa China 2, and we call Australia China 3. And that's the way they look at it. And they own the roads, the port heads, all the transport, all the hotels, all the labour supply companies. The place is overrun by Chinese entrepreneurs. I'm very pleased that Mark mentioned the issue about fish farming. The conversion rate of wild-caught fish is actually now considered to be about 8 kilos of wild-caught fish for every 1 kilo of salmon, for example. And what happens when the fish farms collapse? They often do in a storm. Those sick, poisoned, tortured animals swim out to sea and they sink and they get eaten by other fish. And that poison gets into our system as well. And entire schools of fish are being wiped out. Now, in human history, only 100 billion human beings have ever lived. 7.5 billion human beings are alive today. And we human beings torture and kill 2 billion sentient, living, loving animals every week. We stab and suffocate 1 billion ocean animals every 8 hours. If we were killed at the same rate, human beings would be wiped out in 1 weekend.
Wouldn't that be great?
10,000 entire species are wiped out every year because of the actions of one species. And just to mention to Mark, the United States is the world's worst predator for wiping out species. Actually, it's Australia. I know you said the United States. So we're now facing the 6th mass extinction in cosmological history. And there are many people, Nobel laureates, who are actually saying, and if you look at some of the stuff I've written, you'll see that we are actually predicting that this will be our final century. I often say when I speak to Mark's group that no child under the age of 5 is ever going to reach retirement age. It is a mathematical impossibility. And listening to these two gentlemen here, I think I'm very fortunate to have been able to come out to hear them today because they've inspired me to stiffen the sinews and sums up the blood and get off my backside and actually do something more. So I want to thank them both very much.
Yeah.
Meat and they must.
I have a question about nanoplastics. I believe animals would be more prone to ingesting it, and therefore we also ingest it. What effect does it have on plant life?
Well, I've looked at some studies on fish and nanoplastics, And the biggest source of that in the diet would be from consumption of fish. Now, one of the problems that we have is that most of our plastic is, or a large percentage of it, is ending up in the ocean. And a lot of it's breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces. And in fact, most people know of this floating island, you know, the size of India in the Pacific. There's just nothing but plastic, and that's increasing at an alarming rate. So, if you're concerned about nanoplastics, the first thing that you would do is to eliminate fish out of your diet. Now, the second thing you want to do is eliminate the sources that are consuming fish meal. You know that over 80% of the fish that's caught is what's called bycatch. That's things that they can't sell to the market, like, you know, penguins and whales and dolphins and things like that. So what they do is they turn it into fish meal, and then they feed them to chicken and to cows and pigs and sheep. And so, you know, well over more than 50% of the fish that's caught actually ends up to these animals. And so now those nanoplastics are ending up in chicken, they're ending up in beef even, and all these other animal foods. And the animal foods, they bioaccumulate all toxins. So not just nanoparticles. If you look at, say, mercury, for example, well, you have about 1,000 times more mercury in fish than you would, say, in the worst sprayed broccoli by comparison. And then you've got other things, you know, like cadmium, PCBs, other industrial pollutants, flame retardants, even there's lots of petrochemicals in our oceans that are bioaccumulating in fish and other animals. And it's becoming an alarming problem. So the first thing that I would suggest, if you're concerned about any of these pollutants, is to avoid animal foods from your diet.